Nebraska Territory, 1867. The wind howled across the empty plains like a hungry wolf, carrying with it the scent of another harsh winter. Most folks said Jeremiah Blackwood was cursed. First his wife died, birthing their stillborn son. Then his crops failed 3 seasons running, and now the bank was breathing down his neck like a rabid dog. What they didn't know was that sometimes the cruelest jokes of fate can become the greatest blessings a man ever receives. The sound of wagon wheels crunching over frozen ground broke the morning silence. Jeremiah looked up from mending his broken fence, squinting against the pale November sun. 3 riders approached his humble homestead, their faces wearing the kind of grins that meant trouble for someone. Well, if it ain't our favorite failure," called out Buck Morrison, the biggest landowner in 3 counties. His companions, the Henley brothers, chuckled like hyenas. "Got something for you, Blackwood?" Jeremiah straightened, his weathered hands still gripping the fence post. At 32, he looked older. Grief and hardship had carved deep lines around his blue eyes and salted his brown hair with premature gray. "Don't want nothing from you, Morrison." "Oh, but you'll want this," Buck said, dismounting with theatrical flair. "Boys and I been talking. You need a woman to take care of you, seeing as how you can't take care of yourself." The brothers laughed again, and Buck gestured toward the wagon. "So we got you one." In the back of the wagon, wrapped in threadbare blankets, lay a woman. Jeremiah's first thought was that she was dead, so still, so pale, but then he saw the slight rise and fall of her chest, the flutter of dark eyelashes against hollow cheeks. "Found her in Omaha," Buck continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Name's Evangeline Potter. Some fancy Eastern lady who took a bad fall from her horse. Been paralyzed from the waist down for nigh on 6 months now. Her family dumped her at the charity house when they couldn't afford the medical bills no more." Jeremiah felt his stomach turn. "You're giving me a woman like she's livestock? Well, she can't walk, but she's got all her other parts." Tom Henley snickered. "Figured you 2 broken down things might make a pair." The woman's eyes opened then, large brown eyes that held a depth of pain and dignity that made Jeremiah's chest tighten. She looked directly at him, and in that moment something passed between them. Not love, that would come later, but recognition. 2 wounded souls acknowledging each other's suffering. "I don't want your charity," Jeremiah said quietly. "Ain't charity," Buck replied. "It's a joke. Whole county's gonna get a good laugh out of this. The failed farmer and the crippled lady playing house together." He spat in the dirt. "Unless you got somewhere else to put her, she's your problem now. Charity house won't take her back." The 3 men mounted up, still laughing as they rode away, leaving Jeremiah alone with the woman in the wagon. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope. "I can hear just fine," she said finally, her voice cultured and soft, with just a hint of Massachusetts accent. "And I understand the situation perfectly." Jeremiah approached the wagon slowly, as if she were a wounded animal that might bolt. Up close, he could see she had once been beautiful, might still be, under different circumstances. Her dark hair was tangled and unwashed, her clothes little better than rags, but her bearing remained proud. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his worn hat, "I'm Jeremiah Blackwood. This here's my homestead, such as it is." "Evangeline Potter," she replied formally. "And before you start feeling sorry for me, Mr. Blackwood, let me save you the trouble. I don't need your pity any more than you apparently needed their charity." There was steel in her voice that surprised him. Most women, in her situation, would be weeping or begging. This one looked ready to fight the devil himself. "Can you—" he started, then stopped, unsure how to ask. "Move my legs? No. Feel anything below my waist? No. Will I ever walk again?" She met his eyes steadily. "The doctors in Boston said no, to that as well." Jeremiah nodded slowly. The wind picked up again, cutting through his thin coat. Winter was coming fast, and he had barely enough provisions for himself, much less a woman who would need constant care. "Well then," he said after a long moment, "I reckon we best get you inside before you freeze to death in my yard. Wouldn't want to give Morrison the satisfaction." Something that might have been a smile flickered across her face. That would be inconvenient. Jeremiah lifted her from the wagon. She weighed hardly anything, all sharp bones and determination. Her arms went around his neck, and he caught a faint scent of lavender beneath the smell of unwashed desperation. She held herself rigid, clearly hating the helplessness. His cabin was small and rough, one room with a stone fireplace, a table he'd built himself, and a bed in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was clean and solid. He carried her to the bed and set her down as gently as he could. "I can't pay you," she said immediately. "I have nothing to offer you except—" "Stop," he interrupted. "Just stop. Let me think a minute." He walked to the window and stared out at his failing homestead. 40 acres of stubborn prairie that fought him every step of the way. A barn that leaked, a well that ran low in summer, and debts that grew like weeds. What was he supposed to do with a paralyzed woman on top of everything else? "I can cook," Evangeline said quietly behind him. "And so, I managed my father's household accounts for years before." She gestured vaguely at her legs. "I'm not completely useless." He turned back to her. "Didn't say you were. You didn't have to. It's written all over your face." Her voice was matter-of-fact without self-pity. "Look, Mr. Blackwood, I understand this is an impossible situation. If you want to take me back to town, I won't hold it against you." "And what would happen to you there?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I'd manage." They both knew she wouldn't. A paralyzed woman with no family and no money wouldn't last a week on the streets of any frontier town. "Winter's coming," he said finally. "Reckon we can figure out the rest come spring." Over the next few days, they established a careful routine. Jeremiah would carry her to the kitchen table each morning, where she would sit and direct him in cooking breakfast. And it was a revelation. Evangeline Potter might not be able to walk, but she could turn his meager supplies into meals that actually tasted like food instead of just fuel. "More salt in the cornbread," she instructed on the third morning. "And if you had any eggs, I could make it rise proper." "Chickens got taken by coyotes last month," he replied, stirring the batter. "We need chickens," she said firmly, "and a garden. This land's good for more than just breaking plows and men's spirits." He looked at her sharply. She was studying his property through the window with the calculating eye of someone who understood farming. "You know about working land?" "My father had a farm in Massachusetts before he got ideas about making his fortune in railroads." Her expression darkened. "That's how I ended up out here in the first place, chasing his fool dreams." "What happened?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she spoke without looking at him. "Father invested everything in a railroad venture that never materialized. We lost the farm, lost everything. He brought us west thinking he could start over, but he took sick in Omaha and died within a week. Mother followed him a month later. I was staying with some family friends trying to find work when I had my accident. The horse, spooked by a rattlesnake, threw me hard. When I woke up 3 days later, the doctor said my back was broken." She finally looked at him. "So here we are, Mr. Blackwood. 2 people with nothing left to lose." That evening, as Jeremiah sat by the fire whittling and Evangeline mended his shirts by lamplight, she spoke again. "Those men who brought me here, they expect you to fail. Most folks do. Why?" He was quiet for a long time, watching the flames dance. "My wife, Rebecca, she died 2 years ago, baby too. After that, nothing seemed to go right. Crops failed. Cattle died. Equipment broke. Started to think maybe I was jinxed. Or maybe you were grieving too hard to think straight." The observation stung because it was true. After Rebecca died, he'd thrown himself into work but without real purpose, just trying to outrun the pain. His farming had become sloppy, his planning haphazard. "What would you do?" he asked. "If this was your land?" Evangeline set down her sewing and looked at him seriously. "First, I'd figure out what this land wants to grow instead of fighting it. Second, I'd make sure I had enough livestock to get through winter and provide income. Third, I'd plan for the long term instead of just trying to survive until next week." You make it sound simple. Simple and easy are 2 different things. She picked up her needle again. "But I'd rather die trying to build something than waste away feeling sorry for myself." The words hung in the air between them, a challenge and a promise. The first real test came a week later, when the temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight and snow began falling in earnest. Jeremiah woke to find ice on the water bucket and his breath visible in the cabin. "We need more firewood," Evangeline said from the bed, wrapped in every blanket they owned. "I know." He was already pulling on his coat. "Stay warm. I'll be back soon." But when he opened the door, the wind nearly knocked him over. The snow was falling so thick he couldn't see the barn, and the cold cut through his clothes like knives. "Jeremiah." Evangeline's voice was sharp with alarm. "Don't be a fool. You'll get lost and freeze to death 10 feet from the door." He hesitated, then closed the door. She was right. He'd seen men die in weather like this, wandering in circles until they collapsed from exhaustion and cold. "So what do we do?" he asked. "We got maybe enough wood for tonight, and this storm looks like it could last days." Evangeline was quiet for a moment, thinking. "How much furniture can we spare?" "What? The table, that chest, the extra chair. We can burn furniture if we have to. And there's probably scraps of wood around the cabin, maybe some books with thick covers." Over the next 3 days, as the blizzard raged outside, they systematically fed everything non-essential to the fire. Evangeline directed the rationing of their food supplies with the precision of a military quartermaster, making sure they had enough to last until the storm passed. But more than that, she kept his spirits up. When the cabin grew so cold they could see their breath even with the fire burning, she told him stories of her childhood in Massachusetts. When their food ran low and his stomach cramped with hunger, she taught him card games to distract them both. When the wind howled so loud, it sounded like demons, she sang, hymns mostly, but also folk songs her mother had taught her. "You've got a nice voice," he said on the third night, as they huddled together near the fire for warmth. "Thank you." She glanced at him. "Rebecca, did she sing?" "Sometimes, while she worked." He stared into the flames. "Different kind of voice than yours. More cheerful, I guess." "I'm not trying to replace her. I know." He looked at her then, really looked at her. The past week had put some color back in her cheeks, and her eyes didn't look quite so haunted. "But I'm glad you're here." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition that they were no longer just two strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were partners in survival. The storm finally broke on the 4th day, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of snow. Jeremiah dug his way to the barn to check on his 2 remaining cows, and found them alive but thin. His small store of hay was running dangerously low. "We need to get to town," he told Evangeline when he returned. "Need supplies and the cows need more feed." "Can you make it in this snow?" "Have to. We won't last another storm like that one." But when he hitched up his sled and prepared to leave, Evangeline surprised him. "I'm coming with you." "Evangeline, it's 20 miles to town through snowdrifts. You'll freeze." "Wrap me in blankets and buffalo robes, I'll be fine." Her tone brooked no argument. "Besides, you'll need help carrying supplies, and I know how to negotiate with merchants." "You can't walk, but I can talk and think and count money." She met his eyes steadily. "Stop treating me like I'm made of glass, Jeremiah. We're partners. Now remember?" The trip to town took 6 hours through snow that came up to the horse's belly in places. Evangeline never complained once, though her lips turned blue with cold and her hands shook by the time they reached the general store. Jeremiah carried her inside and set her in a chair near the pot-bellied stove while he talked to the merchant about supplies. But when it came time to negotiate prices, Evangeline took over. "Mr. Henderson," she said sweetly to the store owner, "I notice you're asking 12 cents a pound for that bacon, but it's been hanging there so long it's starting to turn. I'll give you 8 cents, and you'll be glad to get rid of it before it goes bad completely." Henderson looked startled, then amused. "You drive a hard bargain, miss." "Mrs. Blackwood," she corrected smoothly, not looking at Jeremiah. "And yes, I do." By the time they left town, she'd saved them nearly $3 on their purchases, money they desperately needed. But more importantly, word would spread that Jeremiah Blackwood had a wife, and a formidable one at that. "Mrs. Blackwood?" he asked, as they headed home through the fading daylight. "People will talk less if they think we're married," she said, practically. "And it protects both our reputations. Is that what we're doing, getting married?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know what we're doing, Jeremiah, but I know I don't want to go back to that charity house, and you need help keeping this place running. Maybe that's enough for now." That night, as they shared a meal of bacon and beans by the fire, Jeremiah found himself studying her face in the lamplight. Evangeline Potter was a mystery, educated, refined, but tough as rawhide when she needed to be. She'd been dropped into his life like a stone into still water, and the ripples were still spreading outward. "Tell me about your plans," she said, interrupting his thoughts. "What plans?" "For the farm. For next year. You must have some ideas about what you want to do differently." He shrugged. "Same as always, I guess. Plant corn. Hope for rain. Pray the grasshoppers don't come." "That's not a plan. That's wishful thinking." She leaned forward intently. "This land could support more than just grain, Jeremiah. What about cattle? What about vegetables for the town market? What about sheep for wool? Takes money to make money. I'm barely keeping the bank from foreclosing as it is. Then we start small and build up. We use what we have, save what we can, and reinvest everything in the land." Her eyes were bright, with possibility. "In 5 years, we could have one of the most prosperous homesteads in the county." "We?" She blushed slightly. "I mean, if I'm staying. If this arrangement continues to work out." Over the next few weeks, as winter settled in properly, their arrangement developed its own rhythm. Jeremiah would carry Evangeline to different spots in the cabin throughout the day, to the kitchen table for meals and planning, to the window, where she could watch for weather changes, to the fireside in the evenings, where she would sew or read aloud from his few books while he worked on various projects. She proved to have an almost supernatural ability to stretch their food supplies. Beans and bacon became hearty stews with the addition of wild onions she sent him to dig from under the snow. Cornmeal became actual bread with the sourdough starter she cultivated from scratch. She even figured out how to make a passable coffee, substitute from roasted acorns and chicory root. But more than that, she began to plan. She drew maps of the property on precious paper, marking where they might plant different crops, where additional buildings could go, where they could dig irrigation ditches to make the most of rainfall. She calculated feed requirements for livestock, estimated costs for improvements, and projected income from various ventures. "Look at this," she said one evening in February, spreading her papers across the table. "If we plant potatoes in the lower field where the ground stays moist, we could sell them in town for good money. Everybody needs potatoes. And if we get some chickens like I mentioned, that's eggs to sell and meat for ourselves." Jeremiah studied her neat handwriting and careful figures. "Where would we get the money for seed potatoes and chickens?" "We save it. Every penny we don't absolutely have to spend goes into a jar for spring improvements." She tapped the paper with her pencil. "And I've been thinking about other ways to earn money. Such as, I could take in sewing, mending, alterations maybe, even making clothes from scratch for people who can afford it. All I need is fabric and thread, and I can work from right here in the cabin. Evangeline, you already do more than—" "I want to contribute," she interrupted. "Really contribute, not just be another mouth to feed. This is my home now, too." Her words warmed him more than the fire. Somewhere along the way, without either of them quite realizing it, his temporary arrangement had become something more permanent in both their minds. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought changes neither of them had expected. The first surprise came in the form of a letter delivered by a traveling preacher who stopped by their homestead. "Letter for Mrs. Evangeline Blackwood," the preacher said, looking confused. "Though the address just says Potter." Evangeline went, very still as she took the envelope. The return address was from a law office in Boston. "Bad news?" Jeremiah asked after the preacher left. She opened the letter with trembling fingers, read it twice, then looked up at him with wide eyes. "My uncle, my father's brother, he died 6 months ago. Left me his property in his will." Her voice was barely a whisper. A house in Boston and enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Jeremiah felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. That's wonderful news, he managed. Is it? She folded the letter carefully. I'd have to go back east, live in a city, be the poor crippled niece that everyone whispers about and feels sorry for. You'd be comfortable, safe. I'd be alone. She looked at him directly. Here, I'm useful. I'm building something. I matter. You'd matter there too. Would I? She gestured around the cabin. Look what we've accomplished already, Jeremiah. The storm preparations, the planning, the way we've started to make this place work. I've never felt more alive than I have these past months. He wanted to ask her to stay, wanted to tell her how much he'd come to depend on her, how the thought of going back to the empty cabin made his chest tight with panic. But he couldn't. It wouldn't be fair. It's your choice, he said finally. But you should know, whatever you decide, you'll always have a place here. She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read something written there. And what place would that be exactly? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities neither had dared to speak aloud. Before he could answer, another visitor arrived, Buck Morrison, riding up with his usual swagger but looking less pleased than usual. Heard, you two made quite an impression in town this winter, he said without preamble. Folks talking about how well you managed during the big storm, how smart your wife is with money. What do you want, Morrison? Jeremiah asked. Want to make you an offer. I'll buy your homestead, give you enough to clear your debts and have a little left over. You and your wife can move on, start fresh somewhere else. Why would you want this place? You said yourself it was worthless. Morrison's expression soured. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe with the right management, it could be worth something after all. He looked at Evangeline with calculating eyes. Course, that assumes you keep the management you got. After Morrison left, Evangeline was quiet for a long time. He's scared, she said finally. Of what? Of us. Of what we might accomplish if we stay. She looked at Jeremiah intently. He brought me here as a joke, expecting you to fail even more, spectacularly with a crippled woman to care for. Instead, we've started to succeed. We've barely made it through one winter. But we did make it. And we did it together, as a team. Now he's realizing that his joke might backfire, that the two, broken down people might actually build something worth having. That night as they sat by the fire, Evangeline brought up the letter again. I've been thinking about Boston, she said carefully. About what my life would be like there. Jeremiah's heart sank, but he tried to keep his voice neutral. And? I'd have a nice house and servants to help me get around. I'd have enough money that I'd never have to worry about food or fuel or whether the roof would hold through another storm. She paused. I'd also be completely useless. A burden instead of a partner. You wouldn't be a burden. Yes, I would. She looked at him seriously. Here, I can contribute. I can help build something real and lasting. In Boston, I'd just be existing, waiting to die. So what are you saying? I'm saying I want to stay, but not as your charity case or your convenient arrangement. She took a deep breath. I want to stay as your wife. Your real wife, in every way that matters. Jeremiah felt his heart stop, then start again twice as fast. Evangeline? I know it's not a conventional romance, she continued quickly. I know I can't give you children or dance at the harvest festival or any of the things a normal wife could do, but I can love you, Jeremiah. I do love you. And I hope, you might feel the same way about me. He was quiet for so long, she began to look worried. I loved Rebecca, he said finally. Loved her with everything I had. When she died, I thought that was it for me. Thought I'd used up all the love I had to give. Evangeline's face fell, but he continued. Then you came along, and you showed me that love isn't a finite thing. It's not like water in a well that runs dry. It's more like a fire. The more fuel you give it, the brighter it burns. He reached for her hands. I love you too, Evangeline. Different than I loved Rebecca, but no less real. She smiled then, the first truly radiant smile he'd seen from her, and suddenly he could see the beautiful woman she'd been before hardship and injury marked her. So is that a yes? She asked. That's a yes to everything, to marriage, to partnership, to building something together. He squeezed her hands. But you should know what you're getting into. It's going to be hard work, and there's no guarantee. We'll succeed. I know. But I'd rather fail trying to build something with you than succeed at doing nothing without you. They were married the following Sunday by the same traveling preacher who'd delivered the letter. The ceremony was simple, just the two of them, the preacher, and the endless Nebraska sky as witness. Evangeline wore a dress she'd sewn from fabric Jeremiah had bought in town, and he wore his one good shirt, freshly mended by her careful hands. That night, they talked until dawn about their plans, their hopes, their dreams for the homestead. And if their wedding night was different from most, more conversation than passion, more partnership than romance, it was no less meaningful for that. Spring brought its own challenges and opportunities. Using the money from Evangeline's inheritance, which she insisted on investing in the farm rather than keeping as a safety net, they bought seed potatoes, a flock of chickens, and 2 young calves to add to their herd. Evangeline threw herself into the sewing business she'd planned, and word spread quickly about the quality of her work. Soon she had more orders than she could handle, from simple mending to elaborate dresses for the banker's wife. But the real transformation came in how they worked the land. Instead of Jeremiah making all the decisions and struggling alone, they planned everything together. Evangeline would study the weather patterns and soil conditions, make calculations about planting schedules and crop rotations, while Jeremiah provided the physical labor and practical farming knowledge. The potato crop was their first real success. The lower field, which had been too wet for corn, proved perfect for potatoes. They harvested more than they dared hope for, and the income from selling them in town allowed them to pay down their debts and invest in improvements for next year. But their success didn't go unnoticed. Buck Morrison began stopping by more, frequently, sometimes with offers to buy them out, sometimes just to snoop around and see what they were up to. His manner had changed from mocking to wary to openly hostile. Mark my words, he told Jeremiah one day in late summer. Crippled wife or no crippled wife, you'll fail eventually. This land's got a curse on it, and you can't fight fate forever. After he left, Evangeline was unusually quiet. He's wrong, you know, Jeremiah told her, about the curse, about us failing. I know he's wrong about the curse, she replied, but he might not be wrong about us failing. Not because we're cursed, but because he might make sure we fail. What? Do you mean? Think about it, Jeremiah. We're making him look bad. The big successful landowner brought me here as a joke, expecting you to collapse under the burden. Instead, we're thriving. People are starting to talk about the Blackwood place as an example of what hard work and smart planning can accomplish. She was right, and they both knew it. Morrison's reputation depended partly on being the most successful farmer in the area. If a struggling widower and a paralyzed woman could build a prosperous homestead, what did that say about his own achievements? Their fears proved justified when their well went dry in August. Not gradually, as wells sometimes did during hot summers, but overnight. One day there was water, the next day nothing but mud. That's not natural, Evangeline said when Jeremiah climbed out of the well after checking for blockages. Wells don't just stop producing water like that. What are you thinking? I'm thinking someone might have poisoned it, thrown something down there to contaminate the water or block the flow. They never could prove it, but Jeremiah found strange residue at the bottom of the well that didn't belong there. With their nearest neighbor 5 miles away and no law enforcement closer than the county seat, there was little they could do but dig a new well. The new well cost them most of their potato money and put them behind on other projects, but they managed. Evangeline took on more sewing work, sitting at her table for 12 hours a day until her fingers bled from needle pricks. Jeremiah worked from dawn to dusk, digging the new well by hand and keeping up with the regular farm work. But they survived, and their crop survived, and by harvest time they were back on solid footing. The real test came that winter, when Morrison made his move. It started with rumors. Word spread through town that Jeremiah's marriage wasn't legal, that he'd taken advantage of a helpless woman, that she was being held against her will, that the whole arrangement was scandalous and immoral. Then came the more serious accusations. Someone reported to the county sheriff that Jeremiah was mistreating his wife, keeping her prisoner, possibly even abusing her. The sheriff, a fair man named Tom Wade, rode out to investigate. "I'm sorry about this, Jeremiah," Sheriff Wade said, as he examined their marriage certificate and interviewed Evangeline privately. "But I got to follow up on reports like this." "Of course you do," Evangeline replied calmly. "But as you can see, I'm here of my own free will, I'm well cared for, and I'm very much in love with my husband." The sheriff looked around the neat, prosperous cabin, noted the obvious signs of Evangeline's handiwork and business enterprises, and nodded. "Whoever made these reports," he told Jeremiah as he prepared to leave, "they either got bad information or they got ulterior motives. You folks are doing just fine." But the rumors persisted, and they began to affect Evangeline's sewing business. Some of the more proper ladies in town stopped bringing her work, whispering that it wasn't appropriate to support such an irregular household. "Maybe we should fight back," Jeremiah suggested one evening as they tallied their reduced income. "Tell people who's really behind this." "We don't have proof," Evangeline replied. "And even if we did, fighting rumors with accusations would just make us look desperate." "So what do we do?" She smiled then, the calculating smile he'd learned to recognize when she had a plan. "We make ourselves so successful, so obviously happy, and prosperous, that the rumors look ridiculous by comparison." Her plan was ambitious. They would host a harvest celebration at their homestead, inviting everyone in the county to see for themselves what they'd built together. It was a risk. If people didn't come, or if the event was a failure, it would confirm the rumors about their odd marriage and questionable reputation. But Evangeline had spent the past year quietly building relationships with the women who brought her sewing work and with the merchants who sold their produce. She'd been helpful, fair, and consistently pleasant in all her dealings. When the invitations went out, the response was better than they dared hope. The harvest celebration was held on a perfect October day, with the leaves turning gold and red and the air crisp with promise of winter. Nearly 50 people came, including families from as far as 20 miles away. They toured the property, admiring the neat fields, the productive vegetable garden, the thriving livestock. They ate Evangeline's cooking, pork roasted over an open fire, fresh bread, vegetables from their garden, and apple pies made from fruit they'd preserved. But the real triumph came when people saw Evangeline in action. Far from being a helpless invalid hidden away in shame, she was clearly the social and intellectual heart of the operation. She discussed crop rotation with the men, shared recipes with the women, and entertained the children with stories, while Jeremiah demonstrated his farming techniques. "I got to admit," one of the neighboring farmers told Jeremiah, "when Morrison brought her out here, I thought you were both done for. Never seen anything like what you two have built." "She's the brains of the operation," Jeremiah replied. "I just do what she tells me, smart man," the farmer chuckled. "My wife's been saying the same thing for 20 years. By the end of the day, it was clear that the Blackwood homestead was not only successful, but had become something of a model for what could be accomplished with hard work and cooperation." The rumors died away like smoke in the wind. Morrison showed up late in the day, after most of the other guests had gone home. He looked around at the evidence of their success with poorly concealed anger. "Quite a show you put on," he said to Evangeline, who was sitting in her chair near the dying fire, tired but triumphant. "It wasn't a show," she replied calmly. "It was just our life." "Your life," he sneered. "A crippled woman playing house with a failed farmer. You think this little party changes anything?" "I think it shows people who we really are," she said. "And I think you're afraid that what we've built might inspire others to expect more from their own lives." Morrison's face darkened. You got a smart mouth for someone who can't even stand up for herself. That's enough. Jeremiah stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. You're on my property, Morrison. I suggest you leave before you say something you'll regret. Or what? You'll fight me? A broken-down widower and his crippled wife against the biggest landowner in 3 counties. Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. You have no idea what you're up against. After he left, Evangeline was unusually subdued. He's not going to give up, she said finally. I know. He'll try. Something else, something worse. Let him try. Jeremiah sat down beside her chair and took her hand. We've made it this far together. Whatever he throws at us, we'll handle it. She squeezed his fingers. I love you for that confidence. But promise me something. If this gets dangerous, if he threatens our lives, we'll be smart about it. We won't let pride get us killed, I promise. But Morrison's next move caught them completely off guard. Instead of direct confrontation, he went after their livelihood in a way they hadn't anticipated. It started in November, when the grain elevator, in town, owned by one of Morrison's business partners, suddenly refused to buy their corn harvest. Then the general store stopped carrying Evangeline's preserves and pickled vegetables. One by one, their markets began drying up. They're trying to starve us out, Evangeline said, studying their account books by lamplight. Cut off our income, until we have no choice but to sell the land for whatever they're willing to pay. We still got the sewing business. For now. But if this keeps up, people will start worrying about associating with us. They'll be afraid Morrison will turn his attention to them. Winter was harder that year, not because of weather, but because of isolation. Former friends crossed the street to avoid them in town. Neighbors who had praised their success at the harvest celebration now looked away when they passed on the road. But if Morrison thought hardship would break them, he underestimated what 2 people could accomplish when they truly worked as one. Evangeline expanded her sewing operation, taking on more complex projects and charging premium prices for her expert craftsmanship. Jeremiah supplemented their income by hiring himself out for odd jobs, fence mending, well digging, barn raising, anything that would bring in a few extra dollars. More importantly, they began planning for independence. If the established markets wouldn't take their goods, they would create new ones. Evangeline started corresponding with merchants in Omaha and Kansas City, arranging to ship their produce directly to urban markets that cared more about quality than local politics. Look at this, she said one evening in February, waving a letter excitedly. A restaurant owner in Omaha wants to buy all the potatoes we can grow next year, and he'll pay twice what we were getting locally. That's a long way to ship potatoes. The railroad runs regular freight now. We can get our goods to market faster and fresher than most local farmers can get theirs to town. She smiled with satisfaction. Morrison may have done us a favor by forcing us to think bigger. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. Their expanded operation required more labor than Jeremiah could provide alone, so they hired 2 young men from town, brothers whose own family farm had failed the previous year. You sure about this? Jeremiah asked Evangeline as they watched the brothers Pete and Jake Miller work in the fields. Hiring help when we're still struggling to get by ourselves? Investment, she replied firmly. We need more hands to grow, more crops to make more money. Sometimes you have to spend money to make money. The brothers proved to be excellent workers, grateful for steady employment and impressed by Evangeline's systematic approach to farming. More importantly, they were loyal. When Morrison tried to hire them away with promises of better wages, they politely declined. Mrs. Blackwood treats us fair and pays us regular, Pete told Morrison. That's worth more than promises. By midsummer, it was clear that their gamble was paying off. Their expanded crops were thriving, their direct sales to urban markets were generating good income, and Evangeline's sewing business had grown to include customers as far away as Denver, who paid premium prices for her sophisticated work. But Morrison wasn't finished. His next attack was more subtle and potentially more devastating. It came in the form of a letter from the bank, informing them that their mortgage had been sold to a new holder who was demanding immediate payment of the full balance. The amount was staggering, far more than they owed according to their records. How is this possible? Jeremiah asked the bank manager when they went to town to investigate. Seems there was some confusion about the original terms, the manager said uncomfortably. Late fees, penalty interest, legal costs. It all adds up. Evangeline studied the documents with the sharp eye of someone who had managed household accounts for years. These charges are fraudulent, she said flatly. Half of them are for services never rendered, and the interest rates violate territorial law. Take it up with the new mortgage holder, the manager replied. Nothing I can do about it now. The new mortgage holder turned out to be a company owned by Buck Morrison. Smart move, Evangeline admitted grudgingly as they rode home in shocked silence. He couldn't drive us off the land directly, so he bought our debt and inflated it beyond what we could possibly pay. So what do? We fight it, in court if necessary. Those charges are illegal, and any honest judge will see that. But finding an honest judge proved difficult. The territorial court system was small and interconnected, and Morrison's influence ran deep. Their lawyer, the only one in the county who would take their case, was young and inexperienced, more enthusiastic than effective. As autumn approached and the court date drew near, their situation became increasingly desperate. Even with their improved income, they couldn't possibly pay the inflated mortgage amount. If they lost in court, they would lose everything they'd built together. There's still the money from my uncle's estate, Evangeline said one evening as they went over their options for the 100th time. That's your security, your independence. I won't let you risk it. It's our security now. She corrected. We're married, remember? Your debts are my debts, your risks are my risks. Evangeline, no arguments. If we lose the farm, that money won't matter anyway. We'll use it to fight Morrison, and if we lose, at least we'll know we gave everything we had. The court hearing was held on a gray October morning that seemed to match their prospects. Morrison sat in the front row with his lawyers, confident and well-dressed. The Blackwoods sat at the defendant's table with their nervous young attorney, surrounded by stacks of documents and ledgers. The case hinged on the validity of the additional charges Morrison had added to their mortgage. His lawyers argued that the fees were legitimate costs of transferring and administering the loan. Evangeline and Jeremiah's attorney argued that the charges were excessive and fraudulent. But the real turning point came when Evangeline asked to address the court directly. Your Honor, she said from her chair beside the defendant's table, I've spent the past 2 years managing every aspect of our farm's finances. I know exactly what we owe and what we've paid. These additional charges total more than triple our original mortgage balance, and most of them are for services that were never provided. She proceeded to go through the charges line by line, explaining, in clear, precise language, why each one was either excessive or completely fabricated. Her presentation was calm, logical, and devastatingly effective. Morrison's lead lawyer tried to object, claiming that a woman, particularly a disabled woman, couldn't be expected to understand complex financial matters. It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Counselor, the judge said dryly, I've been listening to Mrs. Blackwood's testimony for the past hour, and she understands these financial matters better than most men I know. Continue, Mrs. Blackwood. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Even Morrison looked shaken by the thoroughness of her presentation. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The inflated charges were fraudulent and unenforceable. The Blackwoods owed only their original mortgage balance plus legitimate interest, an amount they could manage with their current income. But more than that, the judge ordered Morrison to pay their legal costs and imposed a fine for attempting to defraud the court with falsified documents. As they left the courthouse, Morrison intercepted them on the steps. This isn't over, he said, his face red with anger and humiliation. Yes, it is, Evangeline replied calmly. You've tried everything, sabotage, rumors, economic pressure, legal fraud. Nothing worked because we're stronger together than you ever imagined possible. You think you've won? You think one court ruling changes anything? I think you're a bitter man who can't stand to see other people succeed where you expected them to fail, she said. And I think you need to find something better to do with your time than harassing your neighbors. Morrison looked like he might explode, but with the judge and half the town watching from the courthouse steps, he couldn't do much except storm away. That winter was the most peaceful they'd known since Evangeline's arrival. With their legal troubles resolved, and their farm operations running smoothly, they had time to simply enjoy each other's company. They read together by the fire, played cards, planned improvements for the coming year. "Do you ever regret it?" Jeremiah asked one snowy evening as they sat together, her hand in his. "Regret what?" "Staying here. Marrying me. You could have gone back to Boston, lived comfortably. And missed all this?" She gestured around the cabin, their cabin, filled with the evidence of their shared life. "Missed building something real, with someone I love? Never. Even with all the hardship, the struggles? Especially because of the struggles." She turned to face him fully. "In Boston, I would have been comfortable but useless. Here, every challenge we've faced has made us stronger. Every problem we've solved together has proven what we can accomplish as a team." "And what about children?" he asked quietly. It was a topic they danced around but never addressed directly. She was quiet for a long moment. "I can't give you children, Jeremiah. We both know that. If that's something you need..." "What I need is you," he interrupted. "Just you. Everything else is secondary. But you'd be a wonderful father. Maybe. But I'm already a husband, and that's enough for me." He squeezed her hand. "Besides, look what we've built here. This farm, our success, the way we've proven that people can overcome anything if they work together. That's a legacy too." The Isaiwi next spring brought visitors they hadn't expected, a young couple from Iowa who had heard about their success and wanted to learn their methods. Then came a family from Kansas, whose own farm had failed, and who hoped the Blackwoods might have advice or even work to offer. "Word's spreading," Evangeline observed as they watched their latest visitors examine their crop rotation system. "People are starting to see this place as an example of what's possible. Is that good or bad?" "It's responsibility," she replied. "We're not just farming for ourselves anymore. We're proving that the prairie can be tamed, that hard work and smart planning can overcome any obstacle." Over the next few years, their homestead became something of a legend throughout the territory. Farmers traveled hundreds of miles to see their innovative techniques. Agricultural colleges sent students to study their methods. Newspapers wrote articles about the remarkable partnership between the struggling widower and the paralyzed woman who had transformed a failing homestead into one of the most successful farms on the plains. Buck Morrison, meanwhile, seemed to shrink in their shadow. His own operations, run on outdated methods and maintained through intimidation rather than innovation, began to look backward and inefficient by comparison. When young farmers in the area started adopting Blackwood techniques instead of following Morrison's traditional approaches, his influence waned. By 1875, 8 years after Evangeline's arrival, the Blackwood homestead encompassed 320 acres of productive farmland, employed 6 full-time workers, and generated enough income to support not only their own comfortable lifestyle, but also investments in new ventures throughout the territory. But perhaps more importantly, they had become symbols of hope for other struggling families. Evangeline's sewing business had evolved into a successful garment manufacturing operation that provided employment for a dozen women in town. Their direct marketing methods had opened new opportunities for other farmers to bypass local monopolies and reach urban customers. "Look at this," Evangeline said one evening, reading from a letter that had arrived that day. "A farming family in Colorado is naming their new daughter after me. They say our story gave them hope when they were ready to give up on their homestead. How does that make you feel? Proud, scared, responsible?" She folded the letter carefully. "When Morrison brought me here as a joke, he thought he was ensuring your failure. Instead, he accidentally created something that's helping people all across the West." "No," Jeremiah corrected gently. "You created that. Your refusal to give up, your insistence on building instead of just surviving, your belief that we could be more than the sum of our limitations, that's what changed everything." The final confrontation with Morrison came in the summer of 1876, during the territory's statehood celebration. A grand festival was held in the county seat, with displays of agricultural products, demonstrations of farming techniques, and speeches by territorial officials. The Blackwood display was the centerpiece of the agricultural exhibition. Samples, Of their crops, examples of Evangeline's manufacturing work, charts showing their innovative farming methods, and testimonials from dozens of families they had helped over the years. Morrison appeared at their display late in the day, looking older and more bitter than ever. "Quite a show," he said, echoing his words from years earlier. "Hello, Buck," Evangeline replied pleasantly. "How are your crops this year?" "Good enough." He looked around at the crowd of people studying their display, listening to Jeremiah explain their irrigation system. "Seems like you've made quite a name for yourselves. We've been blessed." "Blessed," he laughed harshly. "That what you call it?" "I call it lucky. Lucky I brought you here. Lucky Blackwood was desperate enough to take you in. Lucky you haven't collapsed under your own ambitions yet." "You're right about one thing," Evangeline said calmly. "We have been lucky. Lucky to find each other. Lucky to discover what we could accomplish together. Lucky to live in a place where hard work and determination can overcome any obstacle. Even lucky enough to overcome neighbors who tried to destroy us out of spite and jealousy," Jeremiah added. Appearing at Evangeline's side, Morrison's face flushed. "You think you've won something? You think this little celebration changes the fact that you're still just a failed farmer and a crippled woman playing house?" "No," Evangeline replied steadily. "We're partners who've built something remarkable together. We're proof that people don't have to be limited by their circumstances or their past failures. We're an example of what's possible when two people refuse to give up on each other or their dreams." She gestured toward the crowd around their display. "Look at these people, Buck. They're not here because they feel sorry for us or because we got lucky. They're here because we've shown them something they didn't think was possible. We've given them hope." Morrison looked around at the crowd. Farmers, townspeople, territorial officials, all hanging on every word of Jeremiah's explanation of their success. For the first time, he seemed to truly understand what he had inadvertently created when he brought Evangeline to Jeremiah's homestead as a cruel joke. "You've made me look like a fool," he said finally. "No," Evangeline replied gently. "You did that yourself when you chose to tear others down instead of building something worthwhile. It's not too late to change, Buck. You could still be part of the progress instead of fighting against it." But Morrison was too bitter, too proud to admit his mistakes. He walked away without another word, and they never spoke to him again. 5 years later, when Morrison died alone in his big empty house, Evangeline and Jeremiah attended his funeral. They were among the few mourners, a sad end for a man who had owned thousands of acres but had never learned the value of human partnership. As they stood by his grave, Evangeline reflected on the strange turns of fate that had brought them together. "Do you think he ever understood," she asked, "what he had really done by bringing us together?" "I don't think he could understand," Jeremiah replied. "Understanding would have required him to see past his own bitterness and pride. I almost feel sorry for him." "Almost? He had everything, land, money, power, but he never had what we have. He never had a true partner, someone who made him better than he could be alone." They walked home together across the prairie they had transformed, through years of shared labor and love. Their homestead spread before them in the golden evening light, neat fields heavy with grain, cattle grazing in green pastures, the comfortable house they had built to replace the original cabin, the workshop where Evangeline's seamstresses produced garments that were sold as far away as San Francisco. But more than the physical success, they had created something intangible but infinitely precious, a partnership so complete that each had become stronger than either could have been alone. The struggling widower and the paralyzed woman had indeed become the pride of the plains, not through luck or blessing, but through the simple recognition that two people who refuse to give up on each other can accomplish miracles. In the years that followed, their story would be told and retold throughout the West. The tale of how a cruel joke had become a great love story, how two broken people had healed each other and built something beautiful from the ashes of their separate failures. And in 1885, when Nebraska achieved statehood, Evangeline Blackwood was chosen to represent their county at the state constitutional convention, the first woman in the territory's history to hold such a position. In her acceptance speech, she said simply, Success isn't about avoiding failure. It's about finding the right partner to fail and succeed with. By then, their homestead had grown into a small town that bore their name. Blackwood, Nebraska, was home to nearly 300 people, all of whom owed their prosperity to the example set by the woman who couldn't walk and the man who had learned that love comes in many forms. Jeremiah and Evangeline lived to see their golden wedding anniversary, surrounded by the dozens of young couples whose own success stories had been inspired by theirs. They never had children of their own, but they had helped raise a generation of prairie farmers who understood that the greatest strength comes not from individual achievement, but from the bonds we forge with those who share our dreams. When Evangeline died in 1894, at the age of 67, the entire state mourned the loss of the woman who had become known as the Mother of the Plains. Her funeral was attended by governors and senators, by farmers and seamstresses, by everyone whose life had been touched by her example of grace under pressure and triumph over adversity. Jeremiah followed her 2 years later, and they were buried side by side in the cemetery overlooking the land they had transformed together. Their headstone bore a simple inscription: "Partners in all things." But their real monument was the living community that surrounded their graves, a testament to the truth that even the cruelest jokes of fate can become the greatest gifts, if we have the courage to see possibility where others see only failure, and the wisdom to understand that love is not about what we can give each other, but about what we can build together. The story of Jeremiah and Evangeline Blackwood became legend throughout the American West, proof that the most unlikely partnerships can create the most extraordinary results, and that sometimes what begins as a joke can end as a miracle. We're proof that people don't have to be limited by their circumstances or their past failures. We're an example of what's possible when two people refuse to give up on each other or their dreams. She gestured toward the crowd around their display. "Look at these people, Buck. They're not here because they feel sorry for us or because we got lucky. They're here because we've shown them something they didn't think was possible. We've given them hope." Morrison looked around at the crowd, farmers, townspeople, territorial officials, all hanging on every word of Jeremiah's explanation of their success. For the first time, he seemed to truly understand what he had inadvertently created when he brought Evangeline to Jeremiah's homestead as a cruel joke. "You've made me look like a fool," he said finally. "No," Evangeline replied gently. "You did that yourself when you chose to tear others down instead of building something worthwhile. It's not too late to change, Buck. You could still be part of the progress instead of fighting against it." But Morrison was too bitter, too proud to admit his mistakes. He walked away without another word, and they never spoke to him again. 5 years later, when Morrison died alone in his big empty house, Evangeline and Jeremiah attended his funeral. They were among the few mourners, a sad end for a man who had owned thousands of acres but had never learned the value of human partnership. As they stood by his grave, Evangeline reflected on the strange turns of fate that had brought them together. "Do you think he ever understood," she asked, "what he had really done by bringing us together?" "I don't think he could understand," Jeremiah replied. "Understanding would have required him to see past his own bitterness and pride. I almost feel sorry for him." Almost? He had everything: land, money, power. But he never had what we have. He never had a true partner, someone who made him better than he could be alone. They walked home together across the prairie they had transformed, through years of shared labor and love. Their homestead spread before them in the golden evening light, neat fields heavy with grain, cattle grazing in green pastures, the comfortable house they had built to replace the original cabin, the workshop where Evangeline's seamstresses produced garments that were sold as far away as San Francisco. But more than the physical success, they had created something intangible but infinitely precious, a partnership so complete that each had become stronger than either could have been alone. The struggling widower and the paralyzed woman had indeed become the pride of the plains, not through luck or blessing, but through the simple recognition that two people who refuse to give up on each other can accomplish miracles. In the years that followed, their story would be told and retold throughout the West. The tale of how a cruel joke had become a great love story, how two broken people had healed each other and built something beautiful from the ashes of their separate failures. And in 1885, when Nebraska achieved statehood, Evangeline Blackwood was chosen to represent their county at the state constitutional convention, the first woman in the territory's history to hold such a position. In her acceptance speech, she said simply, "Success isn't about avoiding failure. It's about finding the right partner to fail and succeed with." By then, their homestead had grown into a small town that bore their name. Blackwood, Nebraska, was home to nearly 300 people, all of whom owed their prosperity to the example set by the woman who couldn't walk and the man who had learned that love comes in many forms. Jeremiah and Evangeline lived to see their golden wedding anniversary, surrounded by the dozens of young couples whose own success stories had been inspired by theirs. They never had children of their own, but they had helped raise a generation of prairie farmers who understood that the greatest strength comes not from individual achievement, but from the bonds we forge with those who share our dreams. When Evangeline died in 1894, at the age of 67, the entire state mourned the loss of the woman who had become known as the Mother of the Plains. Her funeral was attended by governors and senators, by farmers and seamstresses, by everyone whose life had been touched by her example of grace under pressure and triumph over adversity. Jeremiah followed her 2 years later, and they were buried, side by side in the cemetery overlooking the land they had transformed together. Their headstone bore a simple inscription, "Partners in all things,